Hello, Bob. I'd like to introduce everyone to you,
Good
Professor
morning,
Bob
Lisa.
Orsi. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, let's see. I am currently a professor of religious studies and history at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, where I've been now for about 7 or 8 years. Before that, I taught at Harvard, Harvard Divinity School, again, religious history. And before that, at Indiana University in Bloomington. I'm from New York City. I grew up in an Italian Catholic family in the Bronx. So yeah, that's about who I am right now.
Yeah, you've been to a lot of places, that's for sure.
I have. The academic life can be a very nomadic existence, and so mine has proven to be that way.
And you and I met over a very interesting project. As listeners will know, I'm a survivor of abuse by clergy, and I met you through a project looking into this issue.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about that a little bit?
Yes, I've been working for a couple of years now on a project on the religious lives of Catholics who are abused by adult Catholics who are abused by children by priests. So I'm focusing primarily on their on people's religious experiences in the years after the abuse. Although, as one survivor told me, there really, in some ways, isn't an after the abuse. It's a long struggle for many people. And so I was curious about. I had been working on, for many years before I began this project, I had been working on a history of Catholic childhoods in the United States. What was it like to grow up a child in American Catholicism in the 20th century? And as I was doing that project, the successive waves, I guess it was the third wave of the sexual abuse scandal broke over the church. And I finally decided that I needed to, since I was thinking about children and Catholicism and children's childhoods in the church, that I really needed to, I was feeling more and more responsible to take up this question about the abuse crisis. And in particular, I was interested in, as I say, the religious context of the abuse, and then, so what, one survivor told me when she think that the abuse, was the abuse Catholic in any way? Because, I mean, I think that's a somewhat controversial claim. Mm-hmm. This survivor, who I trust a great deal, said, and I admire, said, we were all abused in a Catholic way. Everyone who was abused in a Catholic way. So I wanted to explore what there was in the way children were raised in the church that might have contributed to this, and then what the long process was through which people came to religiously, not psychological or sociological, but how did they deal with the religious fallout of having been abused by this trusted figure in their young lives. So that's the project.
Boy, and I've really enjoyed speaking with you, because even before you've come to your conclusions, just in speaking with you, in hearing what other survivors say and have experienced, I've learned a lot. Now, I know you're writing a book about this, and we're all interested in what you'll eventually produce, but can you share a couple thoughts from your book without giving your whole book away?
Absolutely. What you just said about appreciating hearing survivors, other survivors, about other survivors' stories, I have to say that's one of the things that I've learned, is how important it is for survivors to be recognized. In many ways, actually, one of the things that I think was one of the surprises to me was how many survivors told me that as young adults, so after the period of the abuse, sometimes into their 20s and 30s, and we're talking about people who were abused in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s for the most part, they didn't have a word for what had happened to them. They had no name for this experience, first of all. And secondly, they thought the experience had happened only to them, that of all Catholic children in the world, they were the only child to have been abused in this way. And almost every survivor I've spoken to told me that there was a moment of recognition when they suddenly realized that this wasn't only their experience. And that moment almost always came when they were listening to another survivor speaking. So it was almost as if they discovered themselves in the voice of another survivor, in the story of another survivor, which then became the opening for them telling their stories and discovering that they were not alone, that this was not something that happened only to them, and that in fact they could talk about it. They could find a place now to talk about it that was safe and where they'd be heard. So
that's a very powerful image.
Yeah, well, it was a striking, because you would think, of course we know. Surely we know what to call this, but I'm not sure that in the late 70s, 80s, people knew what to call it, particularly because it involved these trusted clerical figures. So that's one thing I've learned, is just how important the act of recognition and affirmation is to survivors, from other survivors, and then also from the church. I think it's very important for survivors that they find sympathetic people in the church who will listen to them, who will recognize their stories, who will understand what they're saying. That has proven to be very important. So that's been a major lesson.
And of course, this may put you on the spot to think faster than is fair, but when you think about it, what are some positive things you hear survivors say the church has done to help them, and any significant mistakes aside from the horrific conspiracies to hide that this happened? But I mean, in good Catholics, giving it a shot, trying to reach out, be helpful. Any tips for these people?
Well, I think, yes. I've thought a lot about this, actually, because I've listened to survivors describe this, and I have spoken, let me say here, that I have spoken to survivors, a range of survivors, some of whom remain Catholics, some of whom came back to the church after a period of separation, others of whom want to have nothing at all to do with the church, and whose anger has even subsided a little bit. They're just done. And then remain outside the church but very angry. So I've spoken to survivors who are in different relationships with the church. What it seems to me that is most helpful is when survivors are listened to, when church officials try not to rush to conclusions, like to say, well, we need to do this for healing, or we need to do this for forgiveness, or survivors ought to do, or even the church ought to do. I think what survivors have most valued are the times when bishops or priests simply listen to them and acknowledge that they have been heard. Yes, we hear you. Yes, this was awful. And to say they're sorry, but not in such a way. I think the problem with sorry comes with, I think there's a problem with sorry, because I think sorry can often mean, I'm sorry, now let's get beyond that.